Welcome to Coastal Matters. I'm Charlie Walters. This show is a co-production of Channel 18, Nantucket Community Television, and the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. And my guest today is Maureen Phillips, who is on the coordinating team of the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy and also an attorney. And we're going to talk about the upcoming ballot question on the April 10th ballot here on Nantucket. And we're also going to talk about Massachusetts state laws governing ownership and use of coastal areas. Thanks for joining me, Maureen.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice to be here.
Let's jump right in with the ballot question. This is a non-binding ballot question. It'll be on the ballot Tuesday, April 10th on Nantucket only. And I'm going to read it out here. It's only one sentence. Should the town of Nantucket take appropriate actions in a time of climate change and sea level rise to preserve Nantucket's coastal beaches as open spaces? Let me do it again for those who might have missed some of the phraseology here.
Yeah, every word's important.
Exactly. Should the town of Nantucket take appropriate actions in a time of climate change and sea level rise to preserve Nantucket's coastal beaches as open spaces? And let me just add that this deliberately does not commit the town of Nantucket to anything except discussion of these topics. It doesn't tie the town to any specific course of action. And it doesn't indicate approval or non-approval by the Board of Selectmen. They had to agree to have this question on the ballot, but it does not mean they endorse or don't endorse this ballot question. For the legal point of view, fire away.
Okay, well, as you say, the critical point is non-binding. That was raised by some people at early discussions because they were concerned that somehow, even though the words non-binding were there, it would mean that there would be pressure brought upon the town or the Board of Selectmen or the Concom, whoever it might be, to be pushed into something that they didn't really want to do. And the whole purpose of this is to get a sense of the island. This was done, a somewhat different resolution was put out there several years ago.
Well, I think it was about 25 or 30 years ago.
Was it that long ago?
Yeah.
All right. And so part of the thing that in putting this together, obviously things are very different nowadays. Sea level rise.
Well, sea level rise, but 30 years ago, most of the people who live and vote on Nantucket now were not here. So
Absolutely.
You have an entirely different assemblage of voters.
Right, exactly. And you've got people who are, and everyone, even including those who were here, going back to the first ballot question, most people are well aware that we have sea level rise, that global warming is impacting the entire world. And sea level rise, especially here on Nantucket, is a problem because we are actually where we are on the continental shelf. This is something I learned in a class I was taking. We're going to get worse impact, actually, on Nantucket than, say, the Vineyard or the Cape will. We will have the worst impact earlier than those other areas. And so it's all the more important for Nantucket to realize that what happened this year, back in Halloween, the Halloween storm in Nantucket, that's where I live, and we had some terrible damage, and the whole swamp, wetlands, marsh at the end of Hither Creek has been essentially covered in sand. And those are things that we really need to have a sense of urgency about. So I think that's what we are trying to do with a ballot question, to get this raised, to get people to talk about it, and then we can bring proposals forward, and we can get the town and the various boards and the nonprofits who worry about these things, like the Land Council and the conservation groups, to do so as well.
As we're taping this, twice in the last month, we've had some pretty severe flooding in the Brant Point area.
Yes.
Along Easy Street.
Yes.
And I can remember 20 or 30 years ago, we had bad flooding around Hobart Avenue, and people were saying, oh, this is a 100-year storm. Well, we had about 3 of those in the space of a year. So
Yes.
this is an ongoing problem. As
Oh.
someone said the other day, this is the new normal for Nantucket.
Absolutely.
Flooding in certain areas is not going to be an isolated event. It's something we're just going to have to learn to live with.
Right, and decide what we're going to do in various parts of the island so that there is a plan in place. Obviously, the harbor and that commercial area, that's going to need to be protected. I think that would be generally accepted, and that's what the DPW is doing, and they'd already done some work, thank God, along Easy Street earlier this summer, so things might well have been worse. But you really need to have a plan. That's part of the issue. I mean, Matticat, there isn't really a plan. And we have a bridge to Smith's Point that's in dire trouble. There are the issues in Sconset, where that's been kind of taken over by a particular group. But is it all being coordinated? Is it being looked? Are we looking at this island as an entire island and thinking about what needs to be protected, what habitats need to be protected, not just what structures need to be protected?
Well, that's where this ballot question comes in, because there is not an island-wide coastal management plan as we speak. There's a plan that addresses town-owned beaches, but the vast majority of the island is not town-owned. 82 miles of coast or whatever, very little of that is town-owned. About the bridge in Matticat, just to go back to that for a moment, the bridge itself is sound. The question is, at what point will the beach come along and be where the bridge is?
Well,
so in other words, the bridge isn't falling apart, but the bridge, who knows how long it'll be, the bridge will be on the actual beach at the rate things are going with erosion.
Right, exactly. And we did have concerns in October, about the pilings on the bridge, and
Yes.
so there's Jersey barriers there, but that's the kind of thing you don't want to have a fire drill after every storm, And since we, as you say, these once in 100-year storms are happening all the time, and unfortunately, even the FEMA, the Emergency Management, federal group, their maps are back in the dark ages. They all need to be revised, the insurance, where people can rebuild, all of that. And they're still kind of pretending that, the once in 100-year storm is the rule, as opposed to, as you say, 3 times in a year storm.
Well, I've mentioned it on this show before, but I'll mention it again because it fits into our discussion. FEMA redrew the floodplains around here and other places about 3 years ago.
Right.
And according to Dave Franzuto, who was the emergency management man at that point, FEMA did this because the old maps did not take into account wave action.
Right.
It's one thing if you have a flood because of a high tide and a storm, but you have to take into account the wave action, especially if you have a lot of wind going on.
Right.
The problem with that is it didn't take into account rising sea level.
Right.
So the redrawing they did, and it was the first time in 30 years they had done this, maybe it's going to have to happen again sooner than we think to take into account sea level rise. And one reason we're getting more and more flooding in downtown Nantucket is sea level rise.
Absolutely. And it's that constant need to be reviewing. I mean, frankly, it's great that they did that 3 years ago.
It is. Definitely.
You can't. I should not. Dismiss that by any means. But
it's a moving target.
It is a moving target, and also how your coast runs up to the shore and the land onshore. Whether you've got a long way to go or whether it's a steeper curve. I mean, there's all kinds of things that impact how storms and, as you say, wave movement impacts things. And Hui in Woods Hole, they've got some wonderful studies, very interesting stuff on their website, about all this.
Well, if you contrast, say, Surfside Beach, which is very, very wide but tends to be flat, compare that with, say, Dionis Beach, which is very narrow but has big dunes.
Yes.
There's no one-size-fits-all on Nantucket. going back to the question before we move on, this was proposed by the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. It's on the ballot with the approval of the Board of Selectmen. Board of Selectmen worked with the Coastal Conservancy on the exact wording, and it does say Nantucket's coastal beaches, and that word coastal was put in there very deliberately because there are some non-coastal beaches on Nantucket, which many people won't be aware of. But just for one example, when Gibbs Pond is not at a high level, there's a larger beach than you might guess along the side of Gibbs Pond. This does not cover that. This is coastal beaches only.
Right,
And
because
as I
we've
said-
had washovers into Long Pond.
Yes.
I've been living there since the 80s, and that's a new phenomenon.
And that pond is not, that's not the only pond where this sort of thing can happen. So
Exactly.
Sackatchew,
Right, exactly.
Hummock Pond, et cetera.
Right.
Let's move on to the interesting topic of Massachusetts state law, which has kept many a lawyer awake for many a night for years and years. And anyway, tell us how Massachusetts treats ownership and use. Begin to tell us how Massachusetts treats ownership and use of coastal areas.
Well, we have to go back, obviously, in history. People may not realize it, but laws that were passed in the 17th century still impact us today. You might have thought we would have started over in 1776, but no, the laws that were passed here when we were still a colony, and which go back, obviously, to common law concepts in England, really inform all of the laws that we have in Massachusetts, and frankly, most of the U.S. But the issue on excuse me, on the ownership of coastal beaches is a very interesting one, because originally, the owner of the land held to the high water mark, and after that,
The mean high tide mark?
I'm sorry, I should have said that. The mean.
Which is another way of saying the average high tide
Right.
mark.
Half of it's above and half of it's below. So the mean high water mark was where private ownership ended. And back in the 1650s, the legislature decided they wanted to encourage private owners to build wharves and piers to have commerce, be improved. So they gave private owners more ownership down to the mean low water mark. And this is, one commentator has called it archaic. I think that's a nice way of putting that it gets in the way all the time. And obviously those are moving targets. We've seen that. We've had examples of that on Nantucket where it's come to litigation almost sometimes because, what watermark are we talking about? When I bought my land, when the last storm came, when, da-da-da-da-da. But this fact of owning to the low water mark gives private owners, more space than they would, say, in most other states.
So they're always going to own to that mark, but that mark may be in a different place from year to year,
Exactly.
depending on erosion and accretion.
Right, because no one's drawn a dotted line somehow under the water. What's interesting is, but there's always been 3 exemptions, which again harken back to the 17th century. As a private owner, you can't prevent the public from coming onto your land there were at least 3 purposes. One was boating, using ships or boats or what have you. One was hunting, and the other was called fowling with a W, meaning, to hunt fowl along the beach.
And fishing is included in
Oh, I'm
hunting,
sorry,
I
yes, and
assume.
fishing, hunting,
Yeah.
yes.
Or theoretically, if there was a deer on the beach.
Well, yeah, if there was a deer on the beach and it was in season and, what have you, you could go on the private land to do any of those things. You can surf cast then from anywhere on Nantucket. You can't, as a private owner, stop someone from doing that. So these are viewed as a little strange, and a lot of people, including myself, would think that, this really needs to be, because no one thought about recreation, obviously, in the 17th century. The beaches weren't used for bathing. They weren't used to get tans.
Well, this predates tourism by
Oh, absolutely.
centuries.
Absolutely. I mean, they were places where people, shell fishing's included. I mean, you can go clamming on private land. You can pick mussels. You can do all of that, and people can't prevent you from doing it.
Let
And
me
that's still
stop
the
you for a
case.
second. When you say people can fish, foul, and navigate, shorthand for what you just said,
Yes.
on private land, anywhere on private land?
Well, within.
Or does it have to be between the mean high tide and the mean low tide?
Oh, well, it doesn't really, if you will. I mean, this is where we are talking about the tidal area, which is right. Yeah, you
Only
can't.
the tidal
you can't
area. I
trump
can't go up beyond the mean high tide and
Right, exactly. But you will know. But you aren't prevented from going down to the mean low tide. You can use then that area that was taken away from public use is still available for those
or public ownership.
from public ownership.
Okay.
Well, and also, yeah, and so the uses by the general public are limited. Now, of course, the town government always has the right under its police powers to, if an emergency is occurring and you've got to get to somebody somewhere and you have to go across private land to take the ambulance or send the boats to rescue somebody. Obviously, that's permitted, to the government. But so the police power's there, and that's something also. The extent of that is also something that can be in flux. So there are ways that some of these are perhaps developing. And as I mentioned to you earlier, it was interesting that someone has commented. The Attorney General has given an informal opinion that the fact that fouling, hunting birds should also allow people to hunt for birds with their binoculars.
This is the Massachusetts
Attorney General. Now, this hasn't been formalized, but that's something that I think we should think about getting formalized, because obviously it's hardly a destructive behavior, and my guess is a lot of people do their birding on private land already. So it's likely, I think, that might be able to get passed. But and then someone else has suggested, and I love this one, that since fishing is permitted, that if you have your fishing gear, if you've got a fishing pole, on your shoulder and you're walking around, you are exercising your right to go fishing, and you're checking out whether you can go surf casting there, and it gives you access then to more beach than if you were just simply strolling around aimlessly.
Let me just make sure I understand this. Between high water, mean high water, and mean low water, it's still private property, but someone can use it for fishing, fouling, navigation.
Yes.
Technically, then, just walking along the beach, technically, is not legal.
Right.
However, if you are on the ocean side of mean low water, then you're not breaking the law. Now, obviously, nobody's been arrested for just walking along the beach between mean high and mean low tide. But in terms of the letter of the law,
The trespass, if you will.
you would have to be walking in the water, ocean side of mean low tide, to be technically legal in
Yes.
In other words, this is a law that nobody is not enforced.
We don't have shore patrols.
Yes.
Looking
owners
out
aren't
for. I've
calling
never
up the
heard
police.
of any owner, no matter how, who they were, thinking this could be possible. But it does have these odd things where you can be swimming in the ocean, and you can swim as long as the water is there. The tides, if it's towards high tide, you can be swimming between the low and the high marks. But if you should put your feet down on the sand, then you've trespassed. But if you're in the water, you're just fine. So
Ought to be a lawyer.
we like to have lots of angels dancing on the head of a pin.
Now, if Massachusetts and the town of Nantucket, or any municipality, have laws that are similar but a little bit different, what happens then?
Well, typically, the very basic rule is if the state has a certain level of, let's say, easy one is penalties for a violation of something, say. And so if the state law say that the state law and Nantucket law both hold that a certain action is illegal, but the state allows you to fine somebody $5,000 a day for every day of the violation. But that allows you. Nantucket can decide then whether it can't make a fine that's larger than $5,000. So the state can set an upper limit on it, but the town can't go above that limit, and also the town can't weaken the impact of the law itself. It can't say, well, you want to protect, this bird species, but we don't want to, or we don't think it's important, so that's off our list. That can't be done. So we don't have, that power to override, anything to make it easier, if you will. We could add bird species if we want. We can make things more limiting. Again, there's limits, obviously, but we can make Nantucket, we can adjust our laws and penalties to within the limits of the state law, and that's perfectly fine to do. And again, that's something that I, as a lawyer, think we need to look at, because the town bylaws, including the wetlands bylaw, which is a big reason why we're talking about all of this, some of the enforcement of those laws has not been looked at for quite a while.
I want to get into wetlands and also beach accretion a little more deeply. But before I get there, tell us about your personal and professional background.
Oh, well, quickly, I grew up in California, came out here with my husband, Doug Horst, who is the island gastroenterologist, I must say. And he and I came to Boston in 74, came to Nantucket in 75, and we fell in love. Not unlike probably most people listening to this broadcast. So I went to law school in Boston, and I'm now, 40 years after I graduated from law school, I am just finishing getting my master's in environmental law. And I'm doing this because of what I've seen on Nantucket, living here as a voter for the last 10 years and having a house here for 20 years before that. You really need to, in order to have an impact, you really need to know, where you are within the structure of the law. And especially since the administration changed this year, a lot of things have changed, and you need to know what can be changed, what can't be changed by executive orders. I mean, it can get extremely complicated. But having been in law school these last years has just been a wonderful experience.
Let's go back to wetlands.
Yes.
Most people think of wetlands as a swamp area, obviously, but wetlands are also the coast.
Yes. Wetlands are, essentially, it's a habitat-oriented law. We want to protect the animals and plants and other living creatures, including humans as well, who live on land where moisture of some kind is necessary for that to happen. So you can have swamps. On Nantucket, obviously, we don't have rivers or really streams, but those would obviously count as well. And of course, the tidal area, which is on Nantucket. Besides the marshes that we have, obviously, it's probably the largest piece of wetlands that we have, and one that is probably the most often put at risk.
And does the federal government have a role in any of this lawmaking?
Yes, it has a confusing role, unfortunately,
because you already have state laws and local laws in the mix.
Right.
So tell us how the feds...
Well, the feds, the EPA, does most of this from a protection point of view in terms of, well, things like water quality and the Endangered Species Act is under the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is under the Department of the Interior. And then you've got the NOAA, what I think of as the Weather Bureau, so to speak. But they have a lot to do about what happens in the ocean, and they do a ton of research along the coasts and are responsible for the forecasts and the storm. They manage and watch what's happening to storms, and they're under the Department of Commerce because Teddy Roosevelt had a fight with somebody in 1910 and decided to take it away from Interior and give it to Commerce. And so we do not have coherent regulation. We have archaic regulation, in Massachusetts, and then we have, a lack of coherence, and then, of course, stability with the current administration. No matter, how you feel about it, all these changes that have been put in create instability because people don't know, okay, what can I do this year, and I'm going to be able to do it next year. I knew what things were before the new administration. So that instability creates a lack of coherence as well. So the more we can do for ourselves on our rock, and if only we're all rock.
You have to go to Maine for that.
Yeah, I think so. Then I think we need to take our fortune in our hands.
As far as the feds go, is the situation you just described, the incoherence, is that ever being addressed, or is this just nobody wants to go near it?
The fiefdoms that have built up over time are, as strong as any medieval castle, and the people within are defending it just as strongly. So to get everyone to let down their drawbridges, to continue this metaphor, you can imagine that would be very hard to do. But you'd have to have such leadership and also an understanding by most of the country that global warming and sea level rise are not going away. And if we don't do something about it, Mother Nature's going to take care of it for us, and we may not like those consequences.
And a lot of the country, of course, is not on a coastline.
Right.
They may have wetlands, they may have riverfront
Yes.
land, but
Yes.
More than 50% of the states are landlocked.
Right.
Which-
Flyovers, as people call them.
Yeah. Let me get into one of the, for me anyway, fascinating parts of state law about coastal property.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens when land erodes and or accretes after that,
Mm-hmm.
and how the ownership of that is looked on. I mean, if you have coastal property and it's eroding, obviously you're losing your land. But if it starts to accrete again, or even if it starts to accrete without having eroded in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
that land belongs to...
Well, if it hasn't eroded in the first place, most of the time, and again, I wish I could say, and this is the rule everywhere, and it's cut and dried and what have you, but if you are lucky enough just to have had accretion to your land, that's your land. You get that benefit in most states, and that would be, and then the mean low and high water marks, move along down there. But that is, it's not a taking. You're not taking anything from the, whoever has control of that part of the ocean. It's not viewed that way. However, again, this is another way that things don't always make sense. If you've lost land and then it should happen, and so, okay, fine, and you've lost this land, that's where it stopped, and then it starts accreting again. It's not always the case that you can own it at least until your original boundary was, because it would have to do with the historical reasons for establishing your original boundary, how the plot lines were done. I mean, each case is crazily individual, and So accretion basically is a good thing, but on top of what you already have. But other than that, it's really crazy, and it's not easily predictable. You'd really have to have surveyors and everybody out there to look at your land if you own land that's on the coast to find out, okay, what happens when this storm comes, and what if it grows and shrinks and grows and shrinks, as we've seen land on the island do all the time within 6 months.
Well, Codfish Park is a good example
Absolutely.
of that. The land on the ocean side of the paved road almost disappeared, but not quite. Now it's building up, not to where it used to be, but it's built up quite a bit.
Right.
What specifically, what are those landowners faced with, aside from the fact that they would appear to be getting their land back? But from what you're saying, maybe it's not going to be their land.
Yeah, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Again, and I'm sorry that I don't know the specifics, but when Codfish Park was established, we go back to the 1880s when that was all plotted out. I think
sounds about
generally,
right.
because that's Baxter Road was done then too as well. I think, there are. You as a landowner can rely. There's the whole concept of being able to rely upon what somebody once told you was your land, can apply. And so it would really depend upon, did anyone go and, if you registered your land with a land court in Boston, that could give you a leg up on things.
And if you didn't,
that might have been a mistake that you should have taken care of. Because registering land in Massachusetts is, the best way you can protect what you have. It may not always work, but if your land is registered, then you're on file everywhere that you own, to this point here, and should that change with the changing tides and storms, then you have a better chance of keeping it there.
let me go back to something we spoke about before we started the tape. Going back to Codfish Park, you have people on one side of the road owning their property, people on the other side of the road, different people perhaps, owning property. If the erosion had continued 20 years ago, whenever it was, and wiped out the oceanfront land and wiped out the public way, you have a new coastal property and new coastal owners. If their land begins to accrete, the town may be out of luck for a public way, may be out of luck. I'm trying to illustrate what you were just saying.
Right.
And the person on the ocean side of what had been a paved road may also be out of luck. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
If your land completely disappears, you may not be getting it back, even though the accretion may go on.
yes. I mean, it is certainly possible.
Yeah.
And again, the lawyer's best answer is always, it depends.
Yeah.
And that certainly is the case here. But again, that's why we should have, there should be some consistent rules that don't require us to go back to 1650 to figure out, who owns what. And especially given, that's why we put in the non-binding resolution, given sea level rise, these are issues that we all know are just going to keep happening, and we need to have a coherent plan. And the Coastal Zone Management Agency of the state has done a great job. If anyone goes to that website, there's great information for tools to figure out, management plans for counties, which we are obviously. So there's a lot of tools out there that we can use, and I know the town and the Department of Emergency Management and the DPW, I mean, they've all, been looking at all of that. But if we could get a group dedicated to this and looking at all the tools and all the possibilities to give people security about what they have here on this island, that I think is, if we could accomplish that goal, that would be really wonderful.
Maureen Phillips, thanks for joining me today. This has been interesting and informative. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Charlie.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for joining me. Please tune in again next time.